Alright, I've been having lots of questions about how sumps work, how overflow boxes work, how to set them up, and what happens in the event of a power outage. So I'm going to go through all my equipment and show you what happens when I turn off the power and what happens when the siphon fails. I've actually got my tank set up so there is no chance of an overflow anywhere. No chance of flooding at all. And start with the overflow box. I actually modified it. It started out at 800 gallons per hour. That's what it was rated at, and it came with this tube. It's a very big siphon tube, 1-inch diameter. Now I noticed with this tube that I often got air bubbles in it, and slowly over time the air bubble in the top started filling really high up, and it started filling up with bubbles, and I was afraid the siphon would fail, and the siphon would fail over time if the bubble got too big. So I was thinking, how can I remedy this? I always saw bubbles in the tube, and they kind of fluttered around in the tube, and they would kind of like flutter down, but then they would collect on the top. So I was thinking if I had a lot bigger water flow, that it would push those bubbles out. Well, I didn't want to buy a bigger pump that cost like $40. So what I did was I got a 1/2 inch tube, and I used it instead of the 1-inch tube. Now this 1/2 inch tube I've had running for a couple days now. There's not a single bubble in it. Since it's smaller, the water has to pass through it quicker because it holds a less amount of volume. So with the faster water moving through it, any bubbles that get in here get pushed right through and out, so the siphon stays intact. So it does reduce the water flow of the overflow box, but if your pump is small enough that you're not going to go too fast for it, this little mod here it'll fix your overflow box so you don't have bubbles and you don't have to worry about your siphon failing. You do have to watch it when you set it up to make sure it can handle the flow though. So the overflow box basically has one tube in this inside box. Water drains into that box as the tank water rises. Then it siphons through this tube into the left side back compartment that stays full all the time. And when that back compartment overfills, drains into this side. It's got this filter sponge on the tube to filter out any big debris, and then the water drains. There's the filter pad and then the tube coming out the bottom. It drains down into my sump tank. I don't have my light yet. I put a little light in here so I can show you. I'm waiting for my light strip to get here so I can set up my plant and algae refugium in here. But I added this, well, first of all, this tube drains. I've got it draining into this side of the tank. On this side of the tank I have plastic bio balls and live rock and a bag of carbon on that side. Then I just added this hang-on back pump. It's actually a Marineland Penguin BioWheel 200. And inside of it, I don't have the filter pad. I put plastic bio balls, and I also put live rock in there at the bottom. So what it's doing is the water first comes into the left compartment, and then it's going to come into this compartment and get sucked up by the hang-on back filter, and that's just going to keep continuous water circulation in my sump tank and provide a little bit more biological filtration. Now what I did here, it might be kind of hard to see, but I've got these foam pads. Now as you can see, when I take it out, the water noise level gets a lot louder. I use this foam pad, put it in there by the filter where the filter releases into the water, and it greatly reduces the sound of the flow of the water. Now in the middle of the sump, I have a protein skimmer, I have my heater, and I have my return pump. On the right side, I have a little refugium, and I'm going to be adding live plant and algae to it once I get my light in a couple days. The return pump is here, and I have it very close to the water surface, and the reason for this is to prevent overflowing, and I'll explain that when I turn off power and when I kill the siphon. So it pumps water back up to the tank, and it drains in right here. This is the tube for it, the white clear tube. It drains into the tank, so it's pushing water. Now as it pushes water into the tank, the water level rises, it goes into the overflow box, and then it siphons back down to the sump tank. So basically the pump is what's making the whole system work. The overflow box is just there to drain water when the tank water rises. So let's go ahead and say that there's a power outage. I'm going to go back in here and switch off my power. Turned off my whole tank, turned off my filter, turned off my pump. Now what's going to happen is the overflow box is going to continue to overflow just a little bit of water until it evens out. So my sump level is going to raise just a little bit. The water is hard to see, but it is a little bit higher, and it's going to continue to raise. What happened now is all the water that was in this tube from the pump, it all drained back into the sump tank, and also, as you can see, I have my drain line. You can barely see it, but that little divot in the water, that's my pump's water flow into the main tank. I have that right at the surface. If that was underwater, it would create a siphon, and it would suck water from a 55-gallon back down into the sump tank, and you would have a huge overflow on your hands. So make sure that your return line to your main tank from the pump, make sure it is very close to the surface. Or you can put it lower in the tank and you could drill a small hole in the tubing right by the surface, underneath the surface, but just underneath it. And that'll make it so you don't have a siphon going back into your tank. You could end up with your whole tank all over the ground if you had your siphon, if you had your tube too low in your tank and it siphoned back all of your water. So as you can see, in the event of a power failure, my tank level rises, but not too high. It's completely fine. And the overflow box siphon, completely intact, not a single air bubble in it. It's still underwater on both sides. It's hard to see it in here, but it's underwater on both sides. Now if we go back, turn everything back on, and we start going again, the water level was slightly lower, and everything will be fine. So if the power goes out, it stops, and then it turns back on just fine. The overflow box is going to keep running, the siphon's intact, and it's good. Now I can show you also what happens. My siphon shouldn't fail because I have it set up where the air bubbles cannot get trapped in there. I've only had it testing for about 3 days, but in about 3 days with this old YouTube, I had about a quarter-size bubble or larger in the top. In about 3 days in this, there's not a single bubble in it. So it seems to have prevented the problem. But let's just say the siphon happened to fail. In the event that the siphon fails, the pump down here, if the electricity is still on, is going to be pumping water. Now what I did is I put this pump very close to the surface. So it can pump water back into the tank, but the tank isn't going to overflow. It's got about half an inch to 3/4 of an inch to raise, and this one's almost already down to as far as the pump can push. It's going to push a little bit more water, but then it's going to be out in the open out in the open air. There is one last thing I have to do for this tank, and that is I need to get a pump that turns off when it overheats or turns off when it's out of water, because this is probably not very safe to have a pump running out of water. Now it's going to happen either way, whether this pump was down on the bottom of the tank or the top. If that siphon fails, it's going to just keep shooting water and keep shooting water until it's not in the water anymore. So placing it at the top of the tank limits the amount of water it's able to shoot up. As you can hear, it's starting to have problems and it's not shooting any much more water. And this tank did not overflow. I still got plenty of level in there. So if I start hearing a weird noise in my house, I realize the siphon's dead, but I do not have an overflow of any type. I think I covered everything. I'm going to go ahead and get my siphon back up, but that's pretty much how overflow box and a sump tank work. Hope this helped.